Hi everyone, I am Kate de Gruchy. I'm going to be speaking on sound and poiesis and music technology's role in this relationship. I'm going to just start with a quote from Blindness and Insight by Paul de Man, in which he writes, "The possibility of making the invisible visible, of giving presence to what can only be imagined, is repeatedly stated as the main function of art." And that's just a grounding quote, which I will turn back to. You can disagree if you like, but unfortunately that's what I'm grounding this research in. This idea of invisible things being made visible, whether that's emotion, whether that's feeling, spirituality, whatever it is that is invisible, making that visible, giving presence to what can only be imagined. So this research I'm taking from my honors thesis, which I did at the Department of African Literature at WITS. I just wanted to say that a lot of this research is tied to my supervisors, Isabel Hofmeyer and Ayabulele Mhlahlo. So firstly, I want to ground us in some frameworks and some theories, two fundamental binaries, which this research is sort of situated in and trying to disrupt. The first being a binary between sound and literature. So coming from a music background and then moving into literature, I sort of felt an implicit link there, but have never really had the time or the space or the education to explore it. And I think that's why I found myself in the African Literature department, because right from the get-go, we talk about orality, oral histories, oral literatures. South Africa, we have so many oral histories, oral literature is so fundamental here. So from the get-go, it's kind of assumed sound and poetry are interlinked and one and the same. From poetic devices, onomatopoeia, rhythm, rhyme, repetition, meter, sound, references to sound, sound images, sound metaphors, whatever it is, they play an integral role in poetry. So I employ Elaine Julian's understanding of the spectrum between orality and literature and the ways in which they interact. And through this understanding, the importance of the sound world within poetry is brought to the forefront, and the dichotomy between literature and orality is dissolved, and it leaves room for poetry to be analyzed as sound, existing within this spectrum. The second dichotomy or binary, which I seek to disrupt, and I think I'm preaching to the converted here, but is the dichotomy between music and noise. Sound is integral to our everyday existence. It's a large arena encompassing music, natural sounds, human noises, language. It plays a large part in our everyday existence and our experience of the world. From noise pollution to worship music, sound is affecting us. An important framework here is Schaeffer's breakdown of the dichotomy between sound and music and an understanding of soundscapes. Thanks to Meryl for this one. All of the sounds and noises, so soundscape being all of the sounds and noises surrounding us in a specific location and time, therefore blurring these boundaries between music and sound and noise and allowing for a more nuanced understanding of the role sound plays in our lives. Thus, I start to understand poetry and a poet's persistent evocation of sound, from poetic devices to sound images, but as a poet's evocation of a soundscape. So that's the second theoretical framework. And just a final one to ground ourselves in, sorry for all of this theory, is understandings of the imagination. This one is a very important one for me. So an important theorist here is Wilson Harris. He explores the imaginative potential of the soundscape in his essay, The Music of Living Landscapes. So he doesn't actually use the word soundscape, which is why I pointed it out earlier. So he argues for the links between the music of the living landscape and the imagination. This music is born of the life of imagination's tree, in which sculptor and painter and architect and carpenter and mystic sensitize and resensitize themselves to rhythms and pulses orchestrated through being and apparent non-being. Harris points out the links between the imagination and sound referring directly to rhythm and pulses, and highlights the importance for the artist or mystic to connect with the music of the living landscape in order to connect with being and apparent non-being, that which can only be imagined. Soundscapes, or the music of living landscapes, allow us to connect to that which can only be imagined. Thus, the links between the imagination and sound and poetry are solidified. Cool. So I'm going to delve deeper into these topics. I think the link between poetry and music is fairly well established at this point. Singer-songwriter types, protest music, rap music, spoken word, poetry, artists like K Tempest all have nailed down at this intersection. In her autobiography, Ani DeFranco writes that she hung her hat at the intersection of poetry and music like so many others before her. So this link has become almost obvious. But just going into it slightly deeper, we are talking about repetition, rhyme, rhythm, ideophones, onomatopoeia, alliteration, sibilance, and plosive sounds, meter, sound images, form, and anticipation. So just a quick note on ideophones, because I had no idea what ideophones were, really, when I started this research. They are marked words depictive of sensory imagery found in many of the world's languages. So that includes like onomatopoeia, alliteration, repetition, sound images, but it's important that they are depictive of sensory imagery. So the full depictive potential of ideophones is only unleashed in actual performance, with speech rate, loudness, phonation type, and all gestures contributing to the iconic qualities of these ideophones. In this way, it is often only through the reading out loud of a poem that the ideophones are noticed and can be effective in their depiction of sensory imagery. Thus, in this way, ideophones are integral in igniting the imagination around a certain topic. So I think this idea of performance, of lifting the words off the paper, is already understood by musicians, and it's already understood by so many African literature, African authors, African poets. We need to enter the oral sphere in order to get this point across. So I think what music technology has allowed for us is to dissolve this idea of music and rather analyze this intersection as poetry and sound, or anything as sound, as image and sound, as whatever art form you're interested in, carpentry. Yeah, this idea of performance, and therefore then also using poetic analysis techniques to understand music, to understand motives maybe as metaphor, to understand imagery and all of those wonderful things that poetry allows for. So herein lies the point of my research. It's that poets will use sound to strengthen their images. And as I said at the beginning, I'm arguing that that's the main purpose of art, is to get across this image, this apparent non-being that can only be imagined. So poets will use sound to strengthen this. My personal interests are around spirituality and how poets use sound to evoke the spiritual, because how else are you going to do it? You need something, I suppose, ephemeral. So I've got some poetry here. It's from The Wasteland, so T.S. Eliot's famous poem. It was deep into my honors, and I was losing the plot a little bit. And so my actual honors is on Mazisi Kunene's poetry, and I was sort of like, okay, this is packed with sound. Like you actually can't not. Every word is about sound. So I thought, why don't I pick up The Wasteland? It's the only book of poetry on my bookshelf. So why don't I start here? And I was so rewarded for that little bit of effort. So I'm going to juxtapose two passages. So for context, The Wasteland is a very industrial poem. That's what we're grounding in, is this sort of industrial revolution and just absolute dismay at the state of the world. So here's the first passage taken from the very beginning of the poem. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish, son of man? You cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there's shadow under this red rock. So So, as I said, you can't get away from sound within poetry. It's there, the roots that clutch, the stony rubbish, the sound of water, or the lack thereof, all important things. But I just want to juxtapose it with the final part of the poem where T.S. Eliot almost, well, I argue, has this spiritual moment. He refers to data, dayadvam, and damyata over and over again, almost chant-like. And he has the final part of the poem. I sat upon the shore, fishing, with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why then, I'll fit you, Hieronymo's mad again. Data, dayadvam, damyata. Shanti, shanti, shanti. So my analysis is that this final part of the poem where he's connecting to this spiritual feeling or this non-being or some kind of desperate plea grounds itself so deeply in sound. Here we literally have a reference to London Bridge as falling down, falling down, falling down. We have the data, dayadvam, damyata, alliteration and repetition and pulse, and the final shanti, 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 clearly a prayer of some sorts or chant or whatever you want to call it. There is this use of sound to connect to the spiritual realm, because how else are you going to do it? And this thesis can be applied. It's been explored. Wordsworth does the same thing. As I've said, Mazisi Kunene does the same thing. This evocation of the sound world is essential for the links to the imagination. So that is the summary of what I've been exploring since being at UCT, and yeah, this rootedness in the imagination, I think, is important in zooming out and in thinking of art across the board, not just music, all kinds of art, and it's the imagination that is grounding us here. So what of music technology's role? So obviously theoretically the soundscapes is essential, and conceptually the idea of a soundscape owes its roots to music technology, or at least it does for me, because that's what Meryl taught me. But being able to sample the sounds around us as a concept is insane. To think that you can just record a sound and then have it, reproduce it, and use it to evoke that space. It's insane. You've got your Zoom recorders. So and I think we all know, we already are well on our way to strengthening our imaginings of a surrounding with panning, reverb. I mean, the reverb is literally just evoking space. Panning, yeah, having sound coming from you at different angles, different spaces, spatial recordings, binaural recording, having speakers all around you in different places. That is strengthening our ability immensely to convey our imaginings, which is the purpose of art. Then there's the idea of compositionally the poet and the composer becoming one, with the imagination taking the foreground, and however best one can evoke a space becomes the measure through which the composer-poet succeeds at imparting their imaginations onto an audience. And then just the idea of virtual reality, I suppose, is also at the forefront, or not the forefront. I would rather not think about it, but it's pretty obviously there going forward. So how that is imagination, and that's the imagination strengthening. And I think it's important to conceptualize our imaginations. What are we imagining? What are we able to imagine? How is that influenced by what we have already been taught, or what we have read, or what we have seen? Our imaginations are so what's the word? Cut off by our own positions in this world. So in this work, I think, is a very important understanding of what the role of the imagination is and what that does for us. And just an understanding that we can only imagine that which we have already been told. Our imaginations are just as affected by our positions as everything else is. So how important it is to be able to use our imaginations, for everyone to be able to use their imaginations, for obviously all artists are using them, and how important that is for us to be able to really understand other people's imaginations and for people to be able to get the point across. And I think, or at least for me, sound seems to be an incredible way to do that. It is so evocative and so important. But as I said, I know I'm preaching to the choir. We all know this. We're all here. So just in conclusion, I think music technology has an undeniable opportunity here, and the options are endless. That which can be imagined, that which needs to be imagined, will be strengthened through sound, however that is. It's strengthened through its sensory implications. So where words fail, sound will prevail. I think there's also an important note on language here. I know Kofi Agau wrote, music is more culturally marked than language ever will be. So we can talk, we can use our words, we can use our language, we can write our poems in words, but music is more culturally marked. It has more of its weight. It has more that it is conveying to us, not in the least through the imagination. So just to touch on the piece that Tamara and I have written, which is coming up next, it's called Destination Futility. So our sort of feeling or sense that we're trying to evoke through the imagination is the idea of a futile destination, of moving through sound and space and getting nowhere and really achieving nothing. But the importance of that. So that's sort of the piece is obviously separate to my talk here now. But really important and really interesting, using soundscape, reverb, sonic metaphor, panning, and sounds to strengthen this imagination of a futile destination, of moving through space and time in order to walk together and to feel these things more intensely, and for our imaginations to be strengthened, all because of music technology. And there's no knowing what good might come if the world's composer, poets, and artists and carpenters can better portray that which can only be imagined and give that to their audiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very, very inspiring talk. We have time for questions. Would you mind fielding a couple of them,
Yeah, I'm happy
please?
to answer.
Great guns. William, you must, perhaps if you'd come up to the microphone because we're streaming out, please.
Thanks, Kate, for that really wonderful presentation. And I think the idea of sound and poetry has really interested me for a long time, or as long a time as I remember hearing Theo Habs's Konka Klanka Tunguska, which is a response to Ingrid Jonker's poetry. And I think there's what really struck me in that instance when I heard this piece and started thinking about it a little bit more was the fact that we gain so much more from the sonic reimagining of Jonker's text than what just one reading of the poem would do. And then Theo went ahead and translated, or had to translate it into Xhosa, and there's this whole extra layer of kind of the coloniality of, well, grappling with the type of trans-languaging kind of issue. But my question to you is a lot more simple, and I guess it has to do with, I mean, you set up this binary between sound and literature, but kind of poetry, and it seems, as you're speaking, that it kind of, all poetry is kind of sound. But I'm wondering whether you can think of instances where poetry is not sound, and what that might change about the stakes for the sonification of poetry in your argument? Because I think there are really interesting examples, perhaps, of moments where poetry loses its sound. And there are moments in the wasteland that I can sort of think about the sonic disintegration, and maybe how that changes things. That's question number one. Question number two is, as a composer, are you exploring this through practice? I'd really like to know a little bit more about that. Thanks.
So with question one, I think, yes, absolutely. I mean, I even remember from like high school poetry analysis, like, you know, this word is written slightly different or spelt slightly differently in this instance, and then spelt slightly differently in that. Those things that wouldn't come through in an oral performance of it. Things like intertextual references, maybe not necessarily coming through either. Italicization, capitalization, spatial positioning. So I think, because poetry is also such a visual thing when you're reading it, so there are different elements coming in. But yeah, so in my instance of the wasteland, as I said, it's impossible to separate sound completely, especially if you're reading a substantial passage. But what I was arguing was just in that last spiritual sort of moment that the sound is exploding out of the page. There's no getting away from it at any moment. And I think sound images is an important thing, and it's kind of where my research began as I was thinking about sonic metaphors. As I said, I'm interested in spiritual things, so I was thinking like church bells signifying church, chanting Our Father who art in heaven, these kind of sonic metaphors coming through, and I think that's an important thing, because if you can't separate poetry from sound because of the alliteration and the rhythm and all of that, you can separate these metaphors. If we're talking about London bridges falling down, if we're referring to sound images, if we're talking about church bells and we're referring to very sonic things, thunder, Mazisi Kunene's thunder and drums and laughter and singing and dancing and very sonic instances over and over and over and over again, you do start to get passages that are bursting with sound and passages that aren't only sound. So yeah, that would be my answer to the first question. And the second question was exploring the links between poetry and sound in my own composition.
Or are you exploring it through your own composition?
Yeah, very much so. Just starting to... It's really difficult because it's two different things. So on the one hand, I've sort of wanted to apply what I know and understand compositionally to how I write poetry. But that's really difficult because I'm sort of thinking, okay, well, like motives and like motivic development and evolution. Now I'm writing a poem. Am I only allowed one word in my poem? And then I just have to like break it down into its syllables and then develop those. So I've tried some of that. Not my favorite thing. And I suppose just thinking about lyrics more as poetry, but it's difficult work. What you actually you'll see in Destination Futility is I tried to sort of bring this in because using my voice, I don't really sing in it, but I do a count. I do a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And that kind of, it's almost like a visceral thing at this point because your piano teacher's been doing it to you since you were 6. So you're like 1, 2, 1, 2. So that almost like a sonic metaphor for, I don't even know if it's a sonic metaphor, but it's just so fundamental to my understanding of music that I can't get away from it. So it's things like that where I am starting to tease out these, but I'm hoping to do a lot more of it. I think there's a lot more potential.
Hi, Kate. Wonderful. I'm going to ask you a question that's maybe it relates back to what Leland was saying. Are we there yet? And the music of notes, the music of sound, and it's certainly something I know we've discussed it in classes, but I think about it a lot in my own work. So at some point I've labeled it, you know, it's electroacoustic music, then it's a sound work, then it's a soundscape, then it's, I heard you talking about visual images, is it visual music, you know, and I'm curious, as a young performer, active practitioner, researcher, what do you think about the terminology and you know, what does that present to you, and you know, are we there yet? Are we going to get there? Well, I'm curious what you think about that. Thanks.
The terminology, I found the terminology of a soundscape to be one of the most freeing things for me, just to really encompass everything. I don't know if we're there yet. I mean, you hear it in your like EDM concerts now. You're getting all sorts of industrial sounds coming at you, and there is really that breakdown, I think. But yeah, I can't say, and I think humans it's more like they feel it, but they don't really know it. So like you will hear people complaining about the dogs barking, and but there's this sort of we're not going the further step to sort of be like, okay, well let's analyze this and what is happening around us. But I think we're getting there.
You know, what I find particularly exciting is that there are so many young up-and-coming composers, practitioners, active. I mean, we have a silent partner in the room, Tamara Ringas, your performance partner, or your creative partner. As a final question, perhaps just very briefly, how do you collaborate? How do the two of you work together, please?
So Tamara's more of the tech guru on in these matters. So we were actually going to do a live performance today, but then Tamara's ill, so I was far too scared to plug in all of the equipment and handle all of the live electronics. So that was a pity, and we had to go for the solid recording. But it's sort of I'll be like, oh, I'm imagining like the shimmery thing, this happens, and then Tamara's like, okay, and brings in all of the tech things. We started doing it where I drive the Ableton. It's very exciting, and Tamara sort of tells me what to do and how to do it, and then I make all sorts of horrible sounds, and then Tamara sort of reins me in. So yeah, I think I bring like a bit of chaos and a bit of experimentation, and then Tamara comes in and sorts out the problems.
I'm quite sure that there are many, many more questions. If you wouldn't mind fielding them, you know, over coffee, over tea, etc.
Yeah, of course.
But Kate, thank you so much. And in her absence also to Tamara, thank you so much. We look forward to the performance.
Cool.
And fantastic stuff.